There are 7 prisons in Dublin City. There's prison in Arbour Hill, St Patrick's Institution, there's the training unit, Mountjoy, Docus, Wheatfield and Clover Hill. And most of you here will know Stephen O'Connor. Stephen coordinates the work of CDETB in the prisons, and also here are the heads of each education unit in the prisons. CDETB has over 60 whole-time teaching equivalents working in the prisons and literally provides a service to hundreds of prisoners, not just from Dublin City but from around the country annually. The Irish Prison Service, the IPS, is responsible for all the prisons in the country, and our next speaker, Michael Donnellan, is the Director General of the IPS. The IPS places, I think, real value on the role of education in the prison service. And it's not just a token lip service, it's a real value. And through Michael, the IPS has put management structures in place to deliver on this commitment. And Michael himself is a key driver behind the role that education plays in our prison service. I'd like to invite Michael Donnellan to address you, please.
Thank you very much. 17,000 of our citizens were committed to prison last year. Of that 17,000, 70% on admission said they were unemployed. 50% of those said they had no occupation. They couldn't think what occupation to put on the form. And 50% had no formal qualifications. I suppose that's the challenge that I want to discuss with you this morning. I want to spend the next 20 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, talking to you about our history, 5 or 6 minutes talking about where we are now, but where we want to go in the future is the most important question. And I suppose our history is interesting because in Ireland, if you look back over the last number of centuries, you'll always find a place where you can put poor people or a place where you put disadvantaged. And we have always kind of called that loosely prison. I could take you back several centuries, but if you just go back to the 18th century, in Ireland we sort of dreamt up this new policy where we wouldn't really deal with those people anymore ourselves, but that we would simply ship them out. And through a large part of the 18th century, we transported most of our poor people, most of our disadvantaged people to Tasmania, well first to the Americas, and then when that market closed up, we transported them to Tasmania, which we know as Van Diemen's Land. And I suppose we need to remember that as part of our history. Several thousand men, and what is forgotten is 5,000 women were transported during this period. The youngest was a 13-year-old girl from Tipperary. And I know in the prisons, and the principal teachers here have been working on trying to remember those people, and we have a special project in Kilmainham which you might visit over the next 2 weeks to remember those people that we transported. But towards the end of that century, the 1800s, we thought that's not a really good idea to be transporting people because a lot of people died on the way. It took 3 months to get to Tasmania. A lot of ships were shipwrecked. A lot of people died. So we decided we'd kind of keep them at home. So places like Mountjoy, which was built as a transportation prison, that was its role. It was to house people. Grangegorman, I heard about it this morning, just opposite the Grangegorman site. It's still there exactly as it was in those days, is the only women's prison in Ireland and England in the 1850s, the Grangegorman prison, where all the women from Ireland were gathered into that prison and then were transported from Kingstown, which we now know as Donnellan. But a more enlightened period happened in that we'd keep them ourselves. So every county built a jail, but also imprisonment then kind of declined because mental institutions increased. And if you look at the 1950s and 60s, and I'm pushing on now, there was about 30,000 people in our mental asylums, 29,000 plus in our mental asylums. And in that period, there was only several hundred in prisons. But since the decision to close down our mental asylums has taken place over the last particularly 30 years, A huge displacement has happened in that several hundred in prison has now grown to several thousand. In the last 5 years, our prison population has increased by 30%. Phenomenal. It's the highest growing prison rate in Europe, 30%. So we grew from a relatively small prison level to an expanding, bursting prison system. And I suppose that's the history. We're now where we are, and we need to see where we're going to go in the future. Just by way of introduction then, we have 4,000 prisoners in jail this morning, just over 4,000. We have 3,400 staff. We have a budget of 315 million. We have 14 prisons, as you heard, and half of them are in Dublin. So 50% are responsibility that falls within this room. And we have our prisons dispersed all over the country, as you can see from the map broadly. And in those prisons then we have 220 whole-time equivalents across the 14 prisons, and there's a whole range of education provision that goes on there, all stuff that you know well about, from FETAC to state exams to Open University to non-accredited learning to the softer stuff, the in-cell learning, art exhibitions, just basic literacy and numeracy. And if 50% of our population at any one time have no formal qualifications, you can see that there is a hunger within a prison system to develop something for people within a prison environment. And so what part do we see education playing within a prison environment? There's no doubt that as part of that enlightened period that I talked about at the turn of the 18th, 19th century, there was a lot about work, that work was just going to be the salvation. So hard labor, that was going to solve people. That was going to make people better and make them less offend. And then I suppose towards the 20th century, there was a move towards people educating people, towards putting right the wrong, making up the default. And education has become a central part of the whole desistance movement, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And this is just about happening because, even in contemporary prison life, I talked to a prison officer 2 weeks ago in Portlaoise, and he said to me, Michael, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I was trained to have 100 prisoners in the morning at 8 o'clock, and if I had 100 prisoners at 8 o'clock that night, that was my job done. What happened to them in between that 12 hours didn't really matter, because I had them. But if we are really going to challenge ourselves as a society and challenge the prison service, we have to be more than just about locking people up. The vast majority of people that we lock up are poor people. The vast majority of people have little or no qualifications and have all the problems that society out there has. Mannix Flynn himself says, his famous quote is that people fall out of society and they fall into prison. And it is so true. People fall into prison for some respite, for some fueling up, and traditionally for punishment. And because we can be very punitive as a society, and yet prison is about punishing people, but it's not for punishment. And people fail to see that, particularly some of the media sector. They want us to be more and more and more punitive with this group of people. Why should they? Why should they go to education? Why should they have money spent on them? Why aren't we being more punitive? And they simply completely miss the point. That these are our citizens, our people. The vast majority of people in Irish prisons, by the way, are Irish people. Unlike, if you went to Belgium today, you'd find 50% of their prison is foreign nationals. The same in Norway, same in Sweden. Very high levels. In Ireland, they're all homegrown. They're our people. So why then have we got such a punitive approach And we in the prison service have been driven by policies that actually have encouraged punitiveness, pushing down on people rather than letting them up. So education has to be a central component of that rising up of this group of people. And you know this group of people because you work with this in the city every day. We just take them off you from time to time and we give them back to you. 80% of people who come into prison for less than 1 year. 80%. So they're all coming home. In Ireland, of our 4,000 prisoners today, 3,990 will leave prison. Probably 10 will die in prison. That's the size of it. So they're all coming out. So it is in our interests to socially include, to reconnect, to do something to help this group of people to get back on the horse. And I see education as that. And we have come to this very late because we saw that locking people up securely was enough, rather than now you have them, what can you do with them? So if normalization is part of our policy, our vision, if integration is part of our policy, then education has to be a key component of that. And this leads me on to what the literature now calls desistance. And desistance is the stopping committing offending, desisting from offending. Now, for the vast majority of people, stop offending when they're about 23 or 4. That goes right down, 23 or 4. So they offend from 16 up until about 24. So if you can hold them for that period, and you can keep them engaged at some level, and train them and educate them and teach them and help them with their self-esteem, then there's a good chance that they'll get out the other side. And they'll find a relationship or a stability or a moment that will take them through. Now, there is another group that just continue to go on offending, and we call this desistance. And desistance is about giving people an opportunity, a life opportunity to stop offending. And for me, one of the critical areas that can be delivered in is in the classroom or in the learning environment. I call it a kind of a light bulb moment. And prisoners call it that as well. So the moment when you think, God, I am worth something. I do have some value. I can learn. I can write my name. I can get a subject into junior cert or leaving cert. And that is what we call in the desistance talk, the teaching moment. The teaching moment where the penny drops, the light goes on. And prisoners say, that was the time. It was that woman, that man, Mr., Miss. They can almost name it. They can name that light bulb moment when somebody put enough into them to get something back out. And I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but we're often dealing with people who are kind of empty vessels, who have to be filled up with a whole range of things, from security and structure and holding them, to actually love and care and recognition, and all of those simple things that education should be about. Recognizing people, recognize them from who they are, rather than the kind of the scumbag or the words we see across our media about these people. Because again, these people are our people. And this whole desistance literature is talking about that there is a real opportunity, if we invest in people, to actually change their lives around, to actually make them into citizens who want to give than who want to take, who want to give us a little bit back than to actually have to take. And I see education as this critical piece of this desistance. And we're not very good in Ireland at counting in the prison system, because we really didn't want to know about our recidivism. And that is, recidivism is about who messes up again, who offends again. And the facts are bad and good. Bad in that within a 3-year period, about 60%, 66% of people who leave prison will have reoffended within 3 years. Now, 33% haven't and won't and will go on. And we can now measure for the first time desistance and recidivism figures. And I believe that there is a window opening. There's a political climate just about dawning that as an Irish society, we have to stop locking people up and we have to invest in them for their futures. And this is kind of brave stuff because it's not popular. It's kind of okay with you, you get it, but you would not believe how Middle Ireland just don't get it. They have little or no time for this group of people, this 17,000 who come in to the prison system. And yet when you hear their stories and you hear their traumas and their abuse and their addictions, you just wonder, how did they survive it all? How did they get to where they got to? And if we wanted some literature on it or some facts or figures, this is an American study, but there's European studies, and I would hope we'd have Irish studies on this. But the empowering of offenders and the impact of education. Now, this is just the impact of education in this US study. It makes people's employability about 13% higher when they get a qualification. It drops the recidivism figure by about 43%. So can you imagine in Ireland, our 66% would go down. And in places like Norway and Sweden, their recidivism figures are about 24% because they have invested at every stage in poor people. And the potential for the return on your investment is about 400%. Yeah. So that if you invest early and you create a whole systemic environment for people, it does pay back dividends. Now, you're doing your strategy at the moment for 5 years. We did a strategy just a year and a half ago for 3 years, and we're halfway through. And I can tell you that for the first time in 5 years, last year we saw a leveling off of our prison population. It was the first time in 5 years. And this year we'll see the first drop in our prison population in that period. That we'll have about 1,300 committals less into prison this year than last year. Now, just in case people get excited about that, but that meant that we were chronically overcrowded in our prison. We were occupying at about 124%. If we were a hotel, we'd be making so much money. Because not only were we 100% full at all time, we were another 23 or 4% full as well. This is called doubling up or tripling up. So we have, for the first time, set out a vision, which we call a sort of decarceration vision, a reductionist vision, saying we are going to reduce our numbers. And here's how we're going to do it. And we've set that out in our strategy, which you can see on our website. And a big part of that strategy is shifting the thinking from security to simply counting the people in the beds over to a whole sort of integration strategy. And working with yourselves on many projects, that shift can now take place. And it's not easy because we are changing a culture. We're changing a culture which has been indoctrinated into us for hundreds of years that basically poor people need to be just locked up and managed, and that will actually help them. But we've now kind of got this new kind of enlightenment over the last 20, 30 years particularly, that if you gave them something else, what would the difference be? So I suppose the challenge that I give to you, and I know you give to me every day, is can we deliver? Can we deliver holistically on this? Because I can't do it, you see, without you. I can't do it without the work that you do in helping people integrate, to help people socially include, to help people feel that they're valued. And that is the most single thing that I think that will make the difference, is that if we can include in people rather than exclude people. So we have a challenge. There's a great opportunity, not least because we're burst as a country. We can't build our way out of this system. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, we had decided we were going to build our way out of this problem. We were simply going to build a few thousand more places. We were going to build 2,400 places out in Thornton in North County Dublin. So we were just going to create more places. And America have tried this, by the way. America have the highest prison population in the world. And then Russia is next. Because they tried to build their way out. And enlightened states like California now are saying, we can't do this anymore. We can't continue to build. We have to stop and get back to community integration. And that is the kind of work that you're doing, is giving people that second, third, and fourth time opportunity. So, thank you very much.